Welcome back, everyone, to the Econ Playground. I'm here today with two great guests. One and a half, I guess, has been on the channel before. Kurtis has been on the channel before, and then Daniel and I did a sort of a shared video together a couple months ago. How about first I have you guys introduce yourself, and then I can get into what we're going to talk about today. So, Daniel, tell us who you are.
Well, I am Daniel. I live in Virginia. We have kids. We chase them around. We're on a farm, run a wedding venue. We have a good old time. I have a lot of tomatoes if anyone's nearby. You can get some because otherwise we're just going to have pizza for the 900th time, which the kids would love. But I hear it's irresponsible if you have it 3 nights in a row.
Mhm.
My wife and I run right under a pen name OGRose, which when we started that in 2011, we did not know it also meant original gangster. We were just going for Opperman Garner Rose. So Michelle's last name, maiden, grandmother, all put together means our God rose as well. We mostly started in fiction, but did a lot in philosophy, theology, and stuff like that. And we that's what we do. That's what we do. So it is wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yes, and well, one thing I'll say is one great thing to do with tomatoes, just slice them up and sprinkle some salt on it, and then eat that whole. That's good enough. There's a great clip of Milton Friedman doing that in one of the Free to Choose episodes. He's going around the marketplace, going, "Look at the amazing marketplace." He just grabs some tomatoes, slices them up, puts salt on it, right? So
Just
that's
puts
something
in
to
his.
do. Yeah.
I'm gonna tell the kids if Milton could do it, you can do it too. I mean, look what it did for him. It worked pretty great. I'm gonna tell the kids that.
Yeah, and one more thing about Daniel, this is the kind of thing that maybe among other things, but I'm definitely sure about this is going to be in the history books in 3,000 years. It was on the podcast that I did with Daniel that we first started talking about CFP, the global revolution in humanity. So
Yes, it was.
that's going to take over the world. Okay, but Curtis, how about you go?
Sure, I am Curtis. I guess I'm an economist. I teach at West Virginia University, live in West Virginia, in Morgantown with my wife and kid. And for the purposes of this chat, I am Marcus's friend, and I keep it CFP. So here we are.
Yeah, keep it CFP. Keep it
Keep it
CFP.
CFP.
Okay, so what we want to talk about today is something that is a little bit of a pet issue of mine, or something that I've been peculiarly interested in since the beginning of undergrad. So all of my more formal academic studies, and I got interested in it in early college, some to some degree from getting reacting to Jordan Peterson, and then the things that he said leading me in interest into American pragmatism, and then finding that Dan Klein, who was already at the econ department at GMU, was talking about similar ideas in the space of Adam Smith. So a great place to marry the way I was thinking to economics, the discipline I was actually studying. And a few years later, in the midst of my first year of grad school, my friend Al Shami and I interviewed Dr. Klein about a paper he had on the positive normative distinction, or perhaps the lack of a distinction, or that the distinction is less clear than one might think, and ways that we can rethink it to solve some of the problems of Pos-Norming, as Dan Klein calls it. And that video has one of my worst uses of a microphone ever. If you go back, and that's really the main criticism you can make of that video if you're going to make any. Um, and I've slowly been thinking about that more and more over the years. I mean, the positive normative distinction, it's a huge fight or a point of tension in a lot of times in economics. It's almost as if, like, oftentimes economists pride themselves on we're doing a positive science, right? So we can present something to the world, right? We're doing something, and we can police the people within our discipline because we're doing a positive science, even though they might come from many different, what are then called normative perspective. So I've been meditating on it a lot over the years, and I'm starting to think of some new perspectives on it. Um, so at the beginning of the summer, the reason I actually went down by Daniel's house is because I was going to Duke to do a 2 week history of economic or history of political economy course with the Hope Center there. And just this wasn't something that was directly talked about but from bouncing a lot of different ideas around, these things started to become a little bit clearer to me. So I released this piece, I guess about a month ago, a month and a half ago now, on rethinking Pos-Norming a little bit in light of the division of labor. And a lot of this was inspired by the readings on Marx and looking at different perspectives on Marx that I hadn't really thought of before, right? I hadn't really read Marx since I was an undergrad, so rereading Marx in light of a lot of the stuff I did in my graduate career helped put a lot of these things together. So I'll link the piece below. It's probably worth reading it in full, but I didn't really do very good editing, I think, on it, I think. But I'll just try to present it to you guys and see the way that you both react, because you both have been thinking about similar things from perhaps different angles, right? So the way that I'd first like to present any kind of practical situation is that someone just finds themselves in the midst of a problem, right? Oftentimes in a discipline we feel as if we have to frame a problem or describe a situation, and then a problem is almost something that we're retroactively trying to describe how it's solved. At least that's the way it is in economics a lot. But phenomenologically, you're presented with struggles, you're presented with conflicts, and you're already in the midst of trying to solve a problem. You don't really get to ask yourself the question, why am I solving this problem? You're already there with a problem. If you're asking, why am I solving this problem? Then, okay, that's the problem that you're at, right? So to live is to already be in a position where you're trying to solve a problem. There's a question in front of you, a confusion that to act is to attempt to answer that question, right? To refuse to, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, to quote Rush. Um, so one way to think about your response is, well, there's a question here. It's a single question, and I'm trying to respond with an answer, right? This is what I'd call the holistic response. You're rallying your whole being, every single faculty of your being, to try to respond to this situation as some kind of hero. So an example would be, I'm hungry, there's a deer, I'm trying to solve that hunger with the deer, and my whole life is about chasing, finding that deer, and then eating it, right? That's just me responding to that situation, right? A second way that we can start to think about it, right, and maybe you might think of a little bit more intellectual conceptualization coming into this step, is what I'd call segmenting, where I say, okay, well, there's this problem, hunger, and I'm actually going to split it into two problems. The first problem is the I don't have any food problem, and the second problem is this food is not healthy for me to eat. Right? These are now two different problems. They require two different answers. The first problem is solved by figuring out how to kill a deer, right? And so I can rally my whole being to kill a deer and then kill the deer and then the deer's dead, right? But it's still not ready to eat. There's another set of problems to which the answer is cooking. Oh, how do I make a fire? How do I put the meat over the fire without it burning? How do I make sure that I've cut out the right parts that doesn't, make it poisonous? I've heard that you're supposed to do that with hunting, right? So they're like two different kinds of problems, right? And so there are gains, perhaps, from even just me as one person separating this into two problems, right? I might gain a lot more focus on one, right? I might be able to really understand certain principles, extract certain principles from the world that are more familiar to this segment, to this portion, from just doing the hunting part. And then there's this other part of the world called the cooking part of the world, and there's certain kind of principles that I can learn or abstract because I've focused and pretended this is the whole world when I'm solving that problem, and I can extract certain principles. Right? And so there's cooking clear principles and there's hunting principles. That initial problem, the holistic problem, right? There's truth there, but it might be hard to say that there are clear single principles about that whole big problem, that solving the hunger problem is doesn't have as strict clear principles as cooking or hunting does, right? Now, so that potentially gives me gains. It gives me the ability to access and create clear, precise knowledge, right? But then it also introduces some problems. These two different parts, the two different ways that I answer these things, have to somehow be coherent to each other and coordinate with each other to answer the initial larger question, right? So if it's just me doing this, then this is the limit of my memory. This is the limit of my ability to kind of see the whole problem, the whole problem that I had before I segmented into two problems, to remember that I had that initial problem and to bring those things back together, right? There's some limits there, right? So I can't segment absolutely everything out, right? But from segmenting, I get some gains, but those gains are limited by my ability to coordinate within myself. And so this naturally extends to the classic chapter one of the division of the wealth of nations, also the Republic, also Aristotle, and all of those other people in between. Um, on the division of labor, right? Which is essentially segmenting, saying, well, there's this whole process to make a woolen coat, there's this whole process to make a pin, and it can be segmented into many different questions. That one large question, how do you make a pin, can be segmented into many, he says, up possibly even 18 operations. He says something like that, right? And then instead of just one person focusing on it at a time, you get a different person focusing on each one at a time. And that allows us to really, really scale, right? And really, really multiply productivity. But now coordination does not just require memory, right? It now requires some kind of intermediate means of communication, right? So we've separated out into something, but now how do I make sure that the way that I answer this question is coordinated with the way that other people answer this question, right? Um, so two ways that we might think of are the ways that the economist is most familiar and the way that the economist is most excited is the price system. This is a lot of what really Adam Smith is teasing out in the whole Wealth of Nations, but it also becomes basically the field of study for economists. That's the conventional view of what economists study is people organizing with respect to prices, and it's incredible and a marvel in and of itself to the degree that people are answering questions like how much do I produce? What kind of thing do I produce? What kind of thing do I produce at what time? What kinds of inputs do I use given the costs of different things? All of these different things are coordinated with each other through the price system, which is kind of amazing, right? Another way you could think of it is bureaucracy, right? Or a spectator observing everyone in the factory. And this is the way that Smith describes it in the first chapter is someone actually observing these people in this factory and saying, hey, you do this job, you do this job, you do this job, right? They're not using prices to coordinate who is doing which piece in the factory. There is a spectator who's observing what are these pins? What are we trying to make here? And then figuring out what all of those tasks are and then aligning each person to each one of those tasks. So which problems should be coordinated by the price system and which problems should be coordinated by explicit bureaucracies? This often has to do with the difference between which kinds of operations. Is it easy for me to say, well, if I'm doing a later part of the production, right, and I know that I just need to buy certain inputs, right, then I don't have to make a custom order every time, right? If there's a standardized set of nails and there's a standardized set of screws, right, then I can just go to the hardware store and buy those. I don't need to be, oh, I'm building this kind of house, so I need these kind of screws. But sometimes if I am building this kind of house, I need to actually go to a specific person, tell them what I want, try to explain the vision such that they can build a piece that will actually fit into my larger overall thing, right? So in that situation, that's a little bit more like a bureaucracy. Now there's a paper by Stephen Chung saying, okay, to what degree do we actually say these people are in the same firm or just still people coordinating on the market? There isn't actually really a clear line. It's really more the nature of their relationship. To what's the shape of their contract? Not are they contracting or are they within a firm together? Um, so man, there's so much to. I'm kind of going all over here, but anyway, there's so much to think about. Um, so one way that you can think about this is people towards the final stages of production, right? And the people who are towards the earlier stages of production. So the baker that makes bread and gives it to someone, right? It's very natural for us to say, oh, that's the person solving the hunger problem, the person that made the bread and gives it to the person, because they can kind of see the hunger in the child dissipating. I don't know if I've never seen that, but you know what I mean. Yeah. The child's no longer hungry, and it's very clearly because this guy provided something that finishes that product, right? And you can kind of see that in the farmer, but you can also see how the farmer is doing something that only very conditionally helps the child. The baker very directly helps the child. So there might be a sort of a sense of a little bit more pride in being in those final stages of production. You can kind of see the whole a little bit better. But also, the people at the later stages of production can't see the whole in ways that they don't realize. They can't see the costs that it took to make that bread. They can't see all the children that are not fed because this bread was not used to feed those children, right? So sometimes certain positions seem like they're seeing the whole better, and so they feel like they are the ones that are answering and coordinating everything and really addressing the real human problems. But actually, they have just as narrow a vision as everyone else, right? Um, and so I guess this is the last thing I'll try to say, and then see what you guys think is. So this distinction is Adam Smith also goes into intellectual division of labor. When you're trying to answer a problem that confronts itself to you as a mental puzzle or an ideological puzzle, right? You're trying to solve this problem, right? And it might be one huge problem. What is justice? You know, how do we solve world hunger? These very, very big problems, right? That can only be effectively addressed if we bracket them off into smaller problems, answer them, and then coordinate those answers. So there has to be some kind of intellectual division of labor, right? And Smith talks about that, and you can start to bracket off into different fields and different disciplines and things like that. And so what we start to think though is that some fields are positive fields and some fields are normative fields. And what this conventionally means is, well, something in a positive field can be true, but it's almost like it's not the final truth, right? If I say, oh, I'm a physicist, so I know that gravity exists. Okay, but this is just a positive thing. Just knowing that gravity exists, right, does not tell you how to live your life. You need values as well. Then there's some people that do normative things, right? Oh, an ethicist, right? They say, well, you should pursue justice, right? And they start to think about what justice is, and they say, well, you can do the normative in a sense is complemented by the positive, but it doesn't need the positive in the same way that the positive feels like it needs something. So there's a sense in which positive, I'm confusing myself now. There's a sense in which the fields that get typed positive are fields who are or are only a subsection of the division of labor, whereas the fields that get typed normative are the ones that have the higher vision or have the wider vision. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one has truth and the other is values or something like that. Um, One thing that I thought of just before we got on is that mathematics feels, a lot of people think of it as the most just, it's true, it doesn't tell you any kind of values field. But one thing that's very important about mathematics is that it's always true hypothetically, right? You make a certain set of assumptions, axioms, and then you explore the world if those things are true, right? So even that positive field is contingent on one being in a position where they've received a set of standards, they've received a set of axioms, which are orienting them to so many other things, right? So the mathematician can do clearly true things within the system, right? And that they can be confident about that if you only know math, you can't really do much in life, right? Um, but that mathematician has done something great if the way that they were set up to do that math was coordinated with other things, right? So the positive systems or positive fields often are really normative, but they're only good because they've been coordinated with other things. So one way to think about modernity is this realization that standardization is possible, right? And therefore we can bracket off people into different intellectual fields and then ask them to coordinate with each other only mediated through those standardizations, right? And then, but what can develop is a notion that progress is defined as being able to standardize things more and more, and then that can lead people into certain very very narrow visions of the world where I've received my standards. You can't question me because I'm acting according to the standards, but these different standardized different bubbles have become alienated from each other. So I guess I have to stop there, and I'll ask Curtis to talk a little bit about his research on different fields and the intellectual division of labor, and
Yeah.
tell me what you think about that,
I want
Curtis.
to get I want to get to my stuff, but I want to back up a little bit because there's just so much you just laid on the table. Firstly, starting with Smith and division of labor. Okay, so you might ask a question of yourself. Should I do this thing? We just bought a house, and there's all kinds of things you got to do around the house, right? Should I do this myself, or should I call somebody in? Okay, so this is a question that Smith might ask. Should you do this yourself, or should you break it up into another task and do it with somebody else? Should you specialize, or should you use the division of labor? And how do you answer that question? Well, you should specialize if the expected gain of specialization is greater than the coordination costs that you will have to undergo because there are costs to specialize. And so we again, this is what you're saying is what economics turns into the study of is these kinds of coordination costs. Now, what you might then say is, well, there's one end, which is we want to produce things. We want output. We want food on the table. And that's maybe a goal that we should be thinking about promoting. And then you might also say, well, what about all that coordination that has to go into it also? And what you're talking about, the positive and normative, you might say, well, all the positive truths that we come up with might be things that help us build better machines, that help us create better output. But all the normative things, they might help us coordinate better. Okay, so there might be a split there where we say, well, there's some things that we study that help us coordinate better, and that also get us eventually that output, but maybe we want them from their own sake. Maybe coordination by itself is something interesting and good. But then there's some things that like, well, we're doing material science. It's like, well, that might not help us like solve world poverty or something. Well, maybe it does like adjacently, but like that's not the goal. It's like the goal is to make better, canvas pants. It's like something I don't know what the goal is, but it's something like it's a production goal, right? Not a coordination goal. And so then you might say, well, why would you? So then we have the division of labor, and we have coordination as complementary things. Then we might ask, within a division of labor, why would anyone specialize in being an intellectual? And this is a question I know you both thought about a lot. And it's like, well, for Marcus, like these monks, right? Why are they specializing in being intellectuals versus somebody? Well, it's because we need to invest in our coordination. Like we're going to have these problems that we're going to face, and we're going to need some guidance when we face those problems, or we're going to have these ethical dilemmas that somebody's going to have to comment on, or somebody's going to show up in court, or somebody's going to. So we're going to have intellectuals specializing because we care a lot about coordination. Okay, and coordination. And so you might think about, was it North that had, Doug North has a paper about how much of GDP is transaction costs. And then McCloskey asked how much of it is persuasion
Yeah,
and things
it's
like that.
North and
These might,
Wallace. Yeah.
yeah, with Wallace, yeah. So you might ask, well, how much of that is coordination? How much are we spending to specialize in coordination costs, which then aid the division of labor in production? And these are, again, maybe not, they're not like completely separable, but I think maybe it's helpful to separate them a little bit. And then it's not a question of whether something is positive or normative, where it's like, oh, well, we're trying to be positive here, and like we're not trying to make any normative claims. It's like, well, are you aiding in production, or are you aiding in coordination? So that's something I was thinking about that may be interesting. So then again, like, why do we have intellectuals as specialists? And this is where I think some of my research could help us a little bit think about these kinds of things. Well, you might say, why might we have a field of philosophy? Well, we're going to have some problems out there, and it's going to be nice to have expert witness come in and talk about this kind of case, and that's going to aid in coordination. Or why might you have a field of chemistry or biology? Like these things, again, along the spectrum, might aid more in coordination or in production. So then economics is interesting. And social science is interesting because it's like, where on the spectrum are we? And this is why I think the debate is stronger where we are, because on one hand, we are trying to answer causal questions about the world. And that might just be a positive, like, oh, does banning abortion lower crime? It's like, well, is that a coordination cost, a production cost? Like, what even kind of question is that? But it's like a question that social scientists might ask. But then you might think, well, if we're political economists, then we're trying to get in the ear of in this case, the political leaders, okay, or the king, and we're going to answer questions about coordination. Does this policy help coordination or not? And so then we can't help but being normative. If we're trying to aid in coordination, if I'm going to use that split, again, maybe you guys can help me think through that a little bit better. And this way, it's not necessarily an is-ought problem. It's just like, what kinds of questions are aiding in these two types of activities? So then with the testability point, you might say, well, if it's easily testable, that means we've basically already agreed on the purpose of this activity. Okay, that's all that means. So testability isn't necessarily like, oh, we can set it up against the truth that we hold in our hands. It's that we've already agreed what that truth is. It's not that we have a singular truth. It's just we've agreed on it. And so in a field like, well, let's take economics. Sometimes we go through these phases on what counts as good and bad economics. And it's not that like we've learned from on high what that means. It's that just we've agreed upon it. And if it's easier to test that is it easier to hold that up against what we've agreed? Okay, then we can get to the point faster, basically. And so you might ask, well, something in chemistry that might be more testable than a claim that's made in sociology. Now, why is that? Well, it's because they can they have this set of recipes, this checklist, this set of rules that they can match up against. Oh, this is a good experiment about it. We can replicate it. We can do it again with a bigger sample. We can do it under different conditions. And these are our rules. And you know what? It holds up. And so it's quicker to test. It's easier to realize the quality of it against our set of rules. And that means, and when that's the case, then we're closer to the production side. So, okay, that was, again, a lot. And I know Marcus said a lot. So let me stop there and hear you guys' reactions there.
Okay, let me say something quick and then turn to Daniel. If I can try to summarize what Kurtis said towards the beginning is, so when you have the division of labor, we've segmented this process into A and B. What you're calling production costs or production problems is the person in A getting better at A or the person in B getting better at B.
Yes.
Whereas coordination costs is A and B. It's the role of the philosopher, right?
Yes.
So the normative sciences tend more towards the latter, and the positive sciences tend towards the former because, and testability is associated with that because we've already cut off a smaller part of the world, right? And we've
Yes.
already decided on something. It has already decided how these things were going to be divided up, right? Um, and then one more thing on that is, and something I realized that I probably should have said initially, and I think I had this idea in the original article, was that you might think of positive sciences as an input that is more generally applicable, right? That can be applied to more different domains and more different spheres, and that might be almost identical to it being standardized, right? Being more generally applicable and being more standardized might be the same thing, and then normative sciences might come along with a little bit more bespoke production, which is why the modern normative theories are so odd because like a 3x5 card kind of philosophy that McCloskey talks about, right? That just says, well, these are the normative rules, and these are just the highest rule in your decision making tree or your decision making apparatus, right? And then that's supposed to solve and reduce all of these other problems, but it's making a mistake by thinking that everything can actually be standardized into its own terms, whether that's Kantianism or Benthamism or whatever you want to call it. So that those are great. And now Daniel, just go for it, Daniel.
Well, you guys are awesome, and all of this is magnificent. And the paper you wrote, Hingel, fantastic. Marcus, the Substack is outstanding, and a lot of things come to mind. I think this is very important. First off, the presentation, the conversation you have with the doctor on basically the problem of the is-ought distinction, the positive norm, splitting these up. How often you can just reword reword positive claims and their normative or vice versa. And I really also like thinking about like what is your active vocabulary, what things, it's not, people are going to use the split is and ought, as I put with my beloved Hume. They're going to use that, and you want to know it, but is that really useful in your active dictionary? And I think I also like how he was saying even the term rational I'm not so sure about, right? And I love that because who thinks that what they're doing isn't rational, right? And rational relative to what norm, to what coordination, right? The one that you impose that is self-evident to you. So there's all these problems with that. And yeah, there's a bunch of things that come to mind. I think first off, because I know we had talked a little bit on the paper on the situation of capital and how Marx might have something to say to a lot of this. And again, I am quite a fan of I prefer value form Marxism, which Marxists hate. They love the labor theory of value, which I don't actually think is really the interesting idea that
Yeah,
you see in Marx.
I've met Marxists that do prefer the value form theory, and that's actually what triggered so many of these thoughts is meeting some of them at the conference. But go ahead.
Well, that's magnificent. I think that is really, really important. Because someone like a Catrone or a Pustone or maybe a Heinrich would really want to stress that the labor theory of value is more historically contingent. That you really want to ask the question of how exactly what is the socialization that has to occur in order to make the commodity form something that's even intelligible to you, right? And that has to come first before you start talking about the labor theory of value. And that would be like chapter one. And so the way I would say that's relevant here, as I understand it, is Marx asked the question of how does the idea of, say, a bundle of, he talks about linen a lot, which is funny because of linen later on, but, like a bundle of linen come to be worth $5. And how is that intelligible to you, right? Because to most people would be like, that's not a fact of nature, right? There has to be some kind of socialization that occurs that makes it logical to you, that makes sense when I say that shovel is $5, right? Or if I were to say that ear of corn is worth 2 oranges, right? Well, there's nowhere in nature that says, a thing of corn is worth 2 oranges or vice versa. Actually, you can get 4 things of corn for $1. So maybe I should say 8 corn for 2 oranges or something. So kind of reverse it. There's no equal sign in nature, right? That kind of fungibility and that exchangeability. And yet there has to come a point where the entire notion of, say, corn being worth $1, I don't even think about. I don't go, wait, there's no say, like, what do you mean $1? What is this concept? Like, it has to be immediate to you. It has to become part of your immediacy. And so that's a socialization. And it's really important, too, because I just would argue that Marx clearly has an understanding of labor as always already situated in a social order. Because he makes this point where he says, if I were to go out and dig a hole in a field, it's work, but it's not labor. So because there's no value, nobody wants the hole in the field, right? So there's already a sociological condition of which makes labor labor, right? And of course, the key is that labor is the unit by which we determine or get a kind of estimation of abstract social use, because that becomes a big concept for him, right? So for me, the thing that Marx is concerned about is that you get trained into a value form of quote unquote, I'll just say commoditization. Koratani is quite good on talking about, mode A, the modes of exchange, and commoditization. We can just say, it basically exchangeability, the ability to trade your time for money. I can trade, two oranges for corn. I view things in terms of their exchangeability or what I can get fiat currency, etc. Right? What ends up happening that concerns Marx is you actually are trained to the place where you are so habituated thinking in terms of the value form of commoditization that you struggle to think any other value form. Like it is difficult to say coordinate according to, say, love or the family, or coordinate according to spirit, right? You could argue that these are different value forms, right? It becomes very difficult to think that. So then, if you have production, let's say you have someone doing the coordination, right? And another term, like I like to think about Gestalt with James Wiggy, who I think is an extremely important thinker, right? So what ends up happening is that even if you have people like who are doing, some people are doing the coordination, some are doing the production, some are in the division, and other people are doing the whole. Well, the whole that people are looking for is actually going to be captured or contained within commoditization, right? And what if there are gestalts beyond that, though? What if there are wholes that actually are possible in the world that are actually thanks to, say, love or spirit or religion or other ways of bringing people together, right? Ideas or conversations like this, right? That have a kind of emergent quality, right? Well, then the problem is you will gradually the risk is gradually getting getting habituated out of the ability to even think other kinds of gestalts, other kinds of wholes. And that's where, he has that famous idea of, fishing in the morning, theory in the evening, this kind of idea that when we get, our very being becomes the division of labor. Like division of labor, we get divided up, right? We're no longer someone who's able to do all of these activities together to be a kind of holistic person, right? That it comes on this deeper level. And so the reason why that could be very problematic is because, if I were to add one part to this, is if there are certain realities in the world that are complex versus complicated. And now I'm thinking about like Harold Mautzowitz or complexity science, a way Jim Rutt would always describe the difference between complexity and complicated. Complicated is where I can take a bunch of like Legos and put them together, or an engine. I can put an engine together and I can take it apart and I can put it back together. I can add it up like the division of labor and so on. That's a complicated thing. A complex thing is like the human body, where if I take it apart, I can never put it back together. I either get the gestalt or I get nothing, right? The complex you have to get the whole, right? It can't be added up. And therefore, the complex also has to be discerned from the beginning. You have to be able to identify that what you're dealing with is complex, not complicated, or you're going to break it along the way, and then you're going to lose the gestalt. You're going to lose the whole, right? Well, if there are realities that are complex, say maybe human social life, or just kind of the ways that humans relate, then you're going to need people who are able to think coordination beyond gestalts that are added up, like divisions or kind of sequenced or kind of put together, right? Well, that means you're going to have to be able to think the normative. That means you're going to have to be able to think the larger picture. And if you can't do it, then you're going to be losing some of those complex realities that are more like environments and ecosystems. And a concern would be that you gradually begin forming a people under the value form of commoditization that can only think in terms of basically gestalts that are complicated, and the category of the complex is not even available to them. It can't even be thought. And that can kind of create various limitations of what we can think and what we can do. And so I think for me, though, the issue is, but here's the problem, and I think this points to Kurtis, and these are just opening thoughts. There's such thing as false gestalts, where we see like this way that everything adds up and it's actually a pitch and novel or a crazy conspiracy, and I'm able to apprehend it and no one else can see it. And I have a lot of prestige, so now I'm going to kind of bring you into it, or I'm a guru. And now we have the cult problem, right? So it's a really, for very good reason, one can kind of be hesitant for talking about, gestalts that are complicated, that are complex, that you really can't test because the whole idea to test them, you'd have to pull them apart. Well, if you pull them apart, you can't put them back together. You just have to buy into them or not. Well, that could lead to a whole lot of trouble. That could lead to a whole lot of power dynamics. That could be an issue. But then at the same time, if there are parts of the human being that have to be taken whole and treated as something that's complex, as a gestalt, then we lose that if we don't take that risk. So the question becomes, how do we take that risk well? And I guess I just go back to the conversation y'all were having with the professor that was so good. He mentioned at one point a problem with the split between the normative and the positive, the is and the ought, as I would put it, is that you kind of get out of training of judgment. Like you get out of the trainment, that part of you atrophies, right? Because you're like, I don't have to judge the good. I can just put I love the part at the end of your paper, Marcus, where you were saying if you think that way, then you don't know your stuff could be used by the enemy. That's so good. That's exactly right. You do all this stuff and then you're pissed off that your paper was used for something you didn't believe in. Well, why are you bothered? I thought you were normative. I thought it was just fine. Yeah, funny how that works, right? But that idea that you atrophy that ability to kind of discern, right? To kind of judge. I think if that is needed in order to avoid false gestalts, then it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're like, well, don't you see the danger of thinking in this kind of normative way that could create conspiracies or take people in the wrong direction? But you do that from a practice that also entropies your ability to discern the true gestalt from the false, if you will. So then it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But then it is genuinely dangerous. There is genuine danger here, but then there is something genuinely lost if we don't take on that danger. And I become very interested. And again, I guess I would just close to say that for Marx, there is something about commoditization and that value form that habituates us according to a social horizon where we get bad at that kind of judgment to value forms beyond commoditization, to kind of the normative, to qualities, that beauty, you could even say, that I talk about with Thomas Jockin all the time, that we atrophy those capacities. And then people say, well, then let's get rid of the pricing mechanism. Yeah, about that. So then you see, then you respond to that by throwing all that. And then you don't have any freaking coordinate. Then you don't have any of the production and all of those problems, right? So to me, so much of the question is how to think that problem without, not knowing how to make a pencil anymore, as the famous story goes. But I'll stop there.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. Let me say a couple of things, just basically just unpacking a little bit what you just said there, is there's then an interesting correspondence between Marx and Mises, right, who are usually normally thought of as opposites, right? In that what Marx is basically saying is he's saying in a capitalist system, you calculate, everyone makes their calculations according to price as a value form, right? That's how you, when supposedly in capitalism, what happens is there's use values of things. These get translated into exchange values, and then people make their decisions based on exchange values, right? And then Mises basically is responding to people saying, well, actually, he's saying, yeah, we cannot make calculations. We cannot make decisions without prices, or else you are groping in the dark, right? But the way that a lot of people realize that is that they read that as Mises saying something like, there is actually no goal other than one person gaining more material. That's why you can't do a calculation, right? But whereas what Mises is actually saying is that any person that believes that they see that whole and that they see the whole thing that they're trying to coordinate is probably wrong, right? And there's a sense in which, okay, yeah, if the firm is small enough, if the group of people is small enough, you can see the whole and you can see all of our problems, and you can hopefully see a little bit over the horizon that we're coordinating with the people or the things or the parts of nature that are not even in our group, right? But if the thing is going to be big enough, listen, you have no way of making decisions relative to all of the other complex factors in the whole society other than these prices which serve as intermediaries. And where Hayek kind of goes beyond is he really kind of unpacks that and makes it about different people who have knowledge in different places, right? And saying that there's a reason that you can't just have a standardized thing that's not prices, right? Because the knowledge of what different things should be valued at is all based on local knowledge, which is inaccessible. It's not even exactly accessible to the people who have it. A line in the use of knowledge in society, which a lot of people skip over, is he says it's not just fragmented knowledge in that a bunch of different people have it. He says it's fragmented and contradictory knowledge, or frequently contradictory knowledge. So it's not like you could just survey everyone all their knowledge and then like be like, now we're going to put it in the same spreadsheet, right? The spreadsheet would say this value is X and not X, right? That would show up all the time. So to have something happen, to have some kind of coordination happen, you have to have people be free to make decisions based on their own local knowledge, and that's going to influence the exchange values, which is going to help us. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? And so to move that to the intellectual division of labor, right? Um, to some degree, we coordinate the intellectual division of labor by prices, right? In that, well, I could be a professor talking about economics online to two people for with unknown productive value, or I could be, driving a truck around. I realized that I actually really like driving long distance, so maybe I would be a trucker in a different life, right? That's an opportunity cost for me, right? They would pay me so much to do this, they pay me so much to do this, right? Um, and I make my decision partially on that. So that contributes to how the intellectual labor gets divided. But there's also these other questions of, okay, once I say something, I've now made a claim, right? You can summarize that claim as a thesis. Are you now going to take that thesis to be an assumption in another paper, right? Or to be a data point that you use in some other part of your own intellectual production, right? Maybe, maybe not. And those things, since they can't be standardized, since each thing is so bespoke, we really think of the intellectual community as much more like a big firm, um, and so like the editors of journals or more prestigious people, they're the people who are really making these kind of oversight decisions, right? They're saying, where's our discipline going? What is good and bad? What fits with the knowledge that a lot of other people say? But then editors also sometimes they have to go, even if I disagree with this, even if I think it's not useful, it fits the standards, right? I know that they did this data is real. This data actually is useful. People would have a useful conversation. So the editor is seen as putting their own values in, being normative as opposed to going by the standards of the discipline by not publishing a paper that fits those standards. So we have so many different mixed ways of thinking, and some people think of them as normative, and some people think of them as positive. Some people think of them as normative questions of judgment within a larger standardized system, and all kinds of things. So Curtis has thought a lot about that. So maybe I'll kick to Curtis a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of thoughts there. So one is Polanyi, in that he talks about the Republic of Knowledge, or the Republic of Science, I should say, which is where we have a bunch of different little nodes. They're all kind of doing our own thing. We all have our own like convictions. Like we strongly believe, like you were saying with Hayek, like X, X is X, and somebody else is like, no, X is Y, and it's like, well, so they both can't be right. Well, how do we coordinate these things? And in science, it's true that we might be selected into science based on something like prices, but we can't coordinate science itself based on prices. We have to use something else. And this is frustrating. I mean, basically, you can't, there's only a few things you can coordinate on prices. Now, a few billion things, but out of all the things, like it's just a few, right? So there's all of this coordination going on that's not priced. I don't coordinate within my household with prices, right? And in science, we can't coordinate with prices. And so what do? Well, we have to debate, and like that's so costly compared to going to the market or buying an option, right? So finding out truth in science. No, okay, so that's another question then. Like, why do we care about intellectuals being right about some claim? And maybe that takes us back around to like this set of values in the Gestalt that you're bringing up. I'm not sure quite what to think about that. In the one sense, it reminds me of Mark was talking about the Auschen and Demset's paper on the theory of the firm. And the point of that paper is to say, sometimes it's really hard to decompose the marginal productivity of one worker to pay them their wage, right? And so what do? Well, you have a manager, like you pay them a wage and you have a manager to like assess how hard they're working. But is that really what they're producing for the firm? Well, no, because they only produce for the firm in combination with everything else. The firm itself is the unit of value, of interesting meaning, right? And so well, then we have a firm competing with other firms. And it's no longer a singular worker competing with other workers. Now there's singular worker firms. There's one employee firms. People are self-employed all the time. They run their their shop. But most of the time you're within a firm. And the firm is the thing, that the unit that has meaning. And like, what is your marginal productivity like inside that firm? It's really hard to tell, right? And then you might even say, well, with the firm within a network of firms in this supply chain is really the thing that's the unit of meaning, right? And so maybe there's prices once in a while coordinating, but otherwise there's like these long-term contracts and like these trade secrets are being like it's not always prices. Um, and so I see what you're saying with like how these layers of higher meaning um, and then the complexity of it, and not just the complicatedness of it. And then the price system itself is another layer to that. So maybe you guys know um, the ant fugue in Godot Escherbach, right? So Aunt Hillary is conscious as the ant hill, and she's like doing her thing, and she has her meaning, and like there's all the other little ants are like the little workers, or in science, like the little individual scientists participating in the republic that only as the whole has meaning. It's hard for me to think about that kind of stuff. I don't know. What do you think?
I'll say two thoughts that are slightly related. One is something that is also in your paper is so in economics we might have in the let's say the intellectual division of labor in economics. Oh, what paper, what result, what claim are we going to admit through the gates of this is consensus belief now, right? And people have when they want to produce something and they want to release something in the world, they want to know what is going to be accepted or not accepted to know if it's worth it for them to produce it, right? Both in the sense of, oh, am I going to get paid for producing this task, but also for the sense of, is producing this idea, is putting my effort into this actually going to benefit the world in some way? If it's not accepted by the community, then it's probably not going to, right? So having relatively clear standards and having consensus, right, is something that encourages and hopefully increases the value of production. So in economics, there were so many debates about which, especially in macroeconomics, which theory dominates. And a lot of this came to a head and was somewhat summarized and revolutionized by Milton Friedman, who has this essay, and it's very much related. This is really where a lot of economists draw back their idea of this is where economics really self-consciously became a positive science, is the Friedman's essays in the early 50s, the methodologies of positive economics or something like that, right? And one of the things that he basically claims in that essay is he says, well, economics does not assume any one theory of the world, right? We're studying the world, and um, and any theory is true or false given to the degree that it can actually predict the world, right? And one advantage of prediction is that, when you make it, and if you make it in clear enough terms, then we can agree whether it came true or not, right? Now there's a bunch of philosophy of science problems with that other people have pointed out, but what's important is that it does serve as a sufficient coordination gate for what research are we going to accept or not accept, mostly, right? Um, but what it does is it shrinks the domain of what kinds of things can be studied, because only anything that you can state predictions in clear terms, right? Things that occur kind of more than once that you can actually observe the variation. This now becomes the limit to the kinds of things that you can produce, the kind of claims that you can produce. And if everyone does that too much, then perhaps you weren't producing very important linkages between sciences that actually solve the larger problem that they were originally divided to try to solve. The other one is related to what you said about Alchin and Demsetz and Marx, and this is I kind of want to reread a lot of Marx with this in mind to see if this is a fresher interpretation that would help understand Marx in terms of the history as well and sort of place him in economic history a little bit better, is that you might think of Marx, and especially observing capitalism, right? Because you could say Marx is a guy that thinks that capitalism is where everything is described in terms of exchange value. That makes him just like Mises, and he's like, oh, great, the world is just, people studying exchange values. Marx is a capitalist, right? But he's criticizing capitalism because he basically thinks that there is something in which you're attempting to measure the production of the world and the value of the things produced in the world in exchange value, but that's a mismeasurement, right? Why? Because it seems like as capital and as certain technologies are getting more important in production, he's seeing the same kinds of things that Alchin and Demsetz are seeing, in that you can't separate two different workers from each other. You have to observe their productivity at the level of the firm, right? And therefore, this becomes an environment in which wages are undervaluing the thing that they're producing, right? So the capitalist still gets to produce, right? Um, the capitalist still gets to produce things with these workers that they've hired, but since you're undervaluing labor, you're actually underusing labor and you're not coordinating it properly. right? So there's this idea that eventually the firm might get so large that it's almost as if it's an interpretation of a Marxist revolution where actually things become so capitalist that capitalism just becomes communism because the monopolies eliminated all competition, and then all workers can be integrated into this plan. So there's an interpretation of Marx in that he's basically saying um, that just like later transaction cost economists like Coase or Alshon, Demsetz, and Williamson are saying, is when it becomes actually difficult to measure and to know the value of something because there is no intermediate market for these input goods, then you actually need to realize that we need other value forms other than exchange value to solve the basic problems of production, and eventually that's going to explode. Now, when as time goes on and different things start to get commodified or different kinds of things become easier to measure, then this becomes kind of Marxist doomerism, like, oh, geez, everything is being commodified. Eventually, they're going to commodify everything. And on one interpretation, if the commodification is happening and it's working, there's no problem with that, right? But there's a sense in which, what if there's something that eternally, finally, always gets um, not put into the equation, is an eternal externality, something that's never priced in that we should have priced in the whole time. That's the real deep fear of Marxism, and that's the fear, is that what exchange value trains people out of seeing things in any other value form, and then they can't produce anything else. So all of I'm watching Battlestar Galactica right now. That's basically the fear of Battlestar Galactica, is that they create the Cylons, right? And then the Cylons, well, this is getting really weird. Battlestar Galactica is pretty good because I'm watching it and I'm on an interpretation that the Cylons are supposed to be Christianity and the humans are the pagans or something. But there's some way in which that we create a machine and tell it to understand things in a value form, and then it eats the whole world up, right? And that's the fear that Marxists have more in capitalism, and that is so fascinating. So yeah, Daniel's got some.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, that puts it very well. And for me, there's also something very interesting where, not to get too much into it, where there's almost a kind of tragedy in how the thinking of the early Marx, which I would argue is kind of more that is more emphasizing a certain alienation of which could lead to that problem. You get locked into a value form, and that basically the world is made in light in that value form. And if there are actually some potentials of the human being that could be realized by a mixture of value forms, you don't get to realize those, and you don't even get to know you didn't get to realize them. It encloses itself, right? You don't know what you don't know, and therefore you're kind of stuck. You're kind of damned because you can't even think the alternative, right? And that is a major problem. But the later Marx is then going to be talking about, well, the value form gets, I think I honestly would call the labor, this is my view, I would call the labor theory of value something instead of like the labor theory of quantifying value. That labor comes to be how value is quantified, not really equal to value. It is the means of quantifying it. And that then leads to the thinking of, instead of an emphasis on alienation, class struggle and class revolution and the dissolving of the state. And that becomes the real emphasis in Marx. And I think you lose this understanding of Marx as having that enclosure principle that you're describing, that I think can actually speak to us today. And I think it actually has relevance to this coordination, production, this like that's being saying, the philosopher of Adam Smith who sees the whole versus the units in the parts, the division of labor, and so on and so forth. Now, I think, of course, the counter to all of this is basically to say, well, if you start talking about multiple value forms, you're going to have computational explosiveness, and people aren't going to have a common denominator. And how are they going to relate? And isn't the world going to blow up? Right? Like, couldn't you talk about the wars of religion being a product of many value forms and a lack of a common language in the form of the commodity? Yeah, it's a big challenge, huh? Big problem that we have to think. And I think that gets into the topic I'm obsessed with the social coordination mechanism, and how does that help with actually better coordinating and forming normative Gestalt thinking, but not in a manner that actually, yeah, because, okay, what I was about to say. I also want to make clear that I'm not saying complex good, complicated bad. And complex absolutely can be associated with the anthill. It can be associated with the swarm of birds. Complexity, I also strongly associate with emergence, which can be a magic word. I don't want to use it as a magic word, but this idea that you get behavior from the collective that is not reducible to any single unit. Like, you see this behavior that is not, it's not really wholes. It's not a whole made of parts. It's almost like a whole that behaves in a manner that's very distinct from everything else. So it's like the mystery, if we think like Elung's vector theory, or Mausewitz in the emergence of everything. everything on the idea that, physics behaves very differently than chemistry, but somehow physics emerges to chemistry. And then chemistry has behavior, physics doesn't. And then somehow chemistry emerges to biology, and biology has metabolism and other functions that chemistry doesn't. And it somehow biology is made up of chemistry, and yet it behaves in a way that is not reducible to chemistry, right? Like, the question of emergence is a great mystery. Well, many people have many theories, and it actually, I think, gets into fascinating theories of how constraints and law and various forms actually make negentropy, et cetera. But the point is that actually, so the idea would be, what if there are complexities, as in behaviors that humans can engage in, that require a multiplicity of value forms, that require actually, but you get all these things that are behaving together that are like a swarm of birds and actually emerge the potentials of the human being that otherwise cannot be there. What Marx would be warning is, if that was so, and you were over habituated into the value form of commoditization, you would never know that. And you also couldn't know you didn't know that. And that would be shut off from you, right? Now, again, what I would argue, there's so many things. It's wonderful speaking with you both. The question becomes, is there a way to do what the pricing mechanism can do? Because like you're saying, like Heike is pointing out, in local not, like people have different ideas of local not. There's contradictions that kind of conflict. And yet that contradiction, almost in a German idealist way, actually generates the potential outcome that gives you the market. It gives you, like, the contradictions are generative. Like the differences actually clashing actually has a generation. And there's also a question, of course, if the actual dealing and wrestling with those differences form people and develop subjects in a way that is also positive, that's actually normatively good, right? So likewise, is there a way actually to have, say, different normative claims or different ideas of the gestalts or different kinds of ideas of values actually kind of run up against one another? And that actually, in that running up against one another, you have testing, you have experimentation that can actually help you manage various value forms to get emergent behavior without the chaos of the religious wars and all of those different problems. There's a lot more to be said on that, but I'll just stop for now.
I've got a couple of things, but if Curtis, you want to go.
Yeah. So one quick thought is that perhaps the normative positive distinction. Sometimes we think, oh well, all the positive things all have this normative like background to it, and that's true. But maybe the reverse is also true, where what we should be thinking about is um, out of the set of normative options, which ones can we positively test? Okay. Now, what is our standard? I have a colleague here, is David Schmitz, and he's awesome in many ways. But he has this idea where we do empirical ethics. That is, let's just look at communities and see how they interact, okay, and how do they live together well. And he argues that this is what Smith and Hume are doing. They're saying, what is it about these communities that they're getting along so well? Like, what's going on here? And in that sense, you're asking positively, empirically, what are the interesting norms? What are the morals happening here? And so then he says, well, the question about justice isn't about how to divide the pie. It's how to respect bakers. Like, that's the question we're asking here. And I think this goes back to your CFP, okay? Because how do we help this coordination process? Well, we have to do some expectations management. This is a phrase that I like to think in terms of, and that just means, like, how do we coordinate? Well, I'm going to tell you, like, this is, when I was an RA, it's like, okay, here's my schedule, and that's just to manage our expectations of each other. And as an employee, I'm going to manage it, or as an employer, so we're always stuck in these hierarchies and you're talking about this, like these power hierarchies and these prestige hierarchies. How do we manage? All we have to do is say, hey, like Marcus will say, hey, I'm in the discussion room today, like in the group chat, like, come by if you want. Like, that's CFP. Like, so we're just doing a bunch of expectations management, and that's how we live together well. Like, that's the interesting empirically grounded norms instead of vice versa, right? So I don't know, just a thought to throw out there.
Yeah, a big part about CFP, I think, is oh, we could try to coordinate by the price system, right? But let's just stop for a little bit, stand in the middle of the marketplace, and like try to actually say out loud, hey, we're going to coordinate in many cases by the price system, by our own local knowledge and things like that. But let's just remember that it is still a community. It's almost like just like just talking out loud a little bit more about implicit processes so that different things can be corrected, right? And so it's a way of trying to disabuse people of the idea that spontaneous order is about each person going at it for themselves, right? Because there's probably many occasions in which you are less strangers with other people than you think. So you could actually form a household, make that Cadillacsy, actually turning strangers into friends who then talk about things and then form firms instead of staying strangers and staying in the marketplace, right? Um, a few different things that I wrote down here. One, the whole thing that you were talking about there, Danielle, about there being different normative standards, which there being different. I guess that's the phrase you used, right? Different normative standards that maybe even contradict, and that is itself generative somehow. Um, that's very much what Kurtis and I are trying to look at when we talk about sets of rules that are complete but inconsistent, right? So sets of rules that are trying to address wider domains, but that don't themselves, just by running the rules as an algorithm, solve the problem, right? But the fact that it's not the most complete but least consistent rule of do the right thing, right? The fact that there's a little bit of meat to it, that there's a little bit of specificity to these rules, right, might help us make a lot, right? But it's also very clear that those are the kinds of institutions, those are the kinds of rule sets that people fear, especially when they're in very peculiar situations, or they're in situations that are so critical. Like, I wouldn't necessarily want property rules to be run that way, right? Maybe in certain cases, like maybe public parks, maybe certain kinds of things that have to be collectively owned for transaction costs reasons, right? But when does my property start? When does my neighbor's property start? I'd prefer that to be pretty consistent, right? But we really only need to deal with it for these kinds of property lines, right? But the larger questions, it might be okay to not have that consistent ethical system because we want to make sure that we can see the whole, right? That we can see the whole. So that's something that's deep into what Kurtis and I have been working on and talking about for a long time. Another thing, when you started talking about the wars of religion, right? Um, a casual um, Catholic response to the wars of religion is they shouldn't have protested, right? That was the problem. They shouldn't have protested. Then we would have all been coordinated, right? Um, but what I'll sort of remind people, right, is that the thing which is doing the coordinating doesn't have to be a single person's vision, right? And it might be that the issue with the Catholic Church was that there was a thought that we can have one person that has that whole vision and they're running everything from the top down. And I'm probably in some ways more anti-Protestant than anti-Catholic, right? I'm neither. I'm a different one. But the that that's part of the issue, is believing that the integrative vision has to actually be a single philosopher, right? The thing that's coordinating all of these people, the thing that is the common interface that they all talk and coordinate in terms of, can be thought of as like a language, right? And a language is something that very possibly has to evolve, people deciding to use or not use this word, to arrange words in this way or not in that way, to create a whole, right? And that whole can actually, that method of coordination can actually adapt to circumstances better than the circumstances that anyone realizes that they're in. A lot of people don't realize this, but Smith had a book, or had an essay about that was the appendix to the Theory of Moral Sentiments. So it came out before The Wealth of Nations. So his theory of language is a spontaneous order, right? And adapting to different circumstances, adapting to trade situations as opposed to local family situations, is something that preceded his Wealth of Nations. And then the last thing I'll say is that on more the Marxism topic, and the worry that the exchange value form is going to be the one that swallows up everything else. Smith has the out here, which is focusing on the philosopher, which is saying that the way that division of labor is organized and reorganized is broken up and refreshed from a person who's not thinking in exchange terms, right? Who's not so stuck in one particular narrow part of the division of labor that they can only coordinate with the others through prices. It's someone that decides to step back and see multiple different parts of it. And people should remember too that in that chapter, Smith says that person that we call a philosopher or the man of speculation. Through the rest of the Wealth of Nations, the man of speculation is what we'd call today an entrepreneur, right? The philosopher does not just mean someone doing intellectual work, right? It can also mean someone doing inter-industry work, right? That's stepping back and deciding to see these different things as things that can be coordinated that no one else realized, that actually breaks up and reforms, and then hopefully the exchange value form readapts itself to incorporate this new information, but the information is always put in there through the entrepreneur. So that's a few years ago when I taught intro micro. Basically, that's the way I taught it. Is I said this is Hayek's theory of how prices incorporate knowledge and coordinate everyone through the marketplace to put different goods towards different ends, right? But the entrepreneur is the person who puts the knowledge in the price, right? And they put the knowledge in the price by knowing something, not by the price, right? So there's non-price knowledge that has to be that's actually in a human mind that is actually the thing that their action inputs into the later price. And so there's always that ability to be free of the value form if you but you have to have an economic theory that doesn't only think about people responding to prices. It's people who act, and prices are one thing in which they coordinate themselves against, right? So yeah, that's a good.
Magnificent. I completely agree on what you're saying about the overlap with the entrepreneur and the philosopher. I might just say philosopher, but I mean, I completely agree with that. 100%. So then there has to be sufficient spaces that would incubate a sufficient number of people who are philosophical to be able to have that function to make sure that the exchange value is not overfitting, right? And so the problem becomes when you lose, like Bernard de Jouvenel, his book on power, I love, like when you lose the middle, when you lose those kind of the churches, the social structure, then you can be losing the spaces that can formulate people in that way. And critically, you could argue that those spaces can make people that have philosophical capacity who are not taken away from the production, the supply chain to an ivory tower somewhere. Now, of course, the ivory tower can be extremely important to send people back into this. I'm not demonizing that or anything, but there's this idea of making sure there's a sufficient amount of that in the system, or else you are prone to get overfitting an autonomous value form that is going to be causing trouble, right? That's going to be making these various enclosures, right? And the problem also becomes like we make our spaces and our spaces make us. There's like James K. Smith, a lot of the sociologists, even like a Christopher Alexander talking about how kind of the spaces we go into, which doesn't just include like the building, there's also kind of you almost, I want to say meta space, because when you throw meta in front of a word, it becomes cooler. But the meta space of the kinds of conversations people are having, the way they talk that kind of form us on a subconscious level, on a subliminal level, that if we don't have spaces we can go into that have a background that is going to form us, or a sufficient number of people to have that philosophical role, then you run the risk of that value form overfitting. So how can you make sure that there's enough of those spaces in the system? And I like to think the social coordination mechanism can help with that. Which again, and to me, there is a way in which the social coordination mechanism can help the overfitting of the exchange value. Now, I have to say a lot more on that. But I also wanted to say on what you're saying about language, I would argue with Thomas Jockin, who I adore, that when Aristotle talks about virtue ethics, he wants to describe virtue like you're describing language, as it's a theory of virtue that is about how to respond to a surprise in a manner that actually maintains the polis, like when you don't know what's going to occur. That's why he's emphasizing things like wit, humility, judgment, discernment, because theoretically, if in every sort of encounter that could be problematic, you had people that had virtue ethics. There was no top down, but if in every encounter you had people act in such a manner, then it would be like a flock of birds without there being a top down, right? And there's supposed to be something about virtue that actually has that function in a system. But it's very, very different, but it can't be. But here's the problem. It's a dare I say, ethical system that really cannot be systemized. It's about the conditioning of each individual person relative to each encounter by which they can discern the mean of what is appropriate for the social interest. So in this situation, it would be, can you discern the CFP? Can you, in a surprising situation, you don't expect, you're able to discern the CFP, right?
By the
But
way, we
that's
have a
live.
term for that. There we have a term for that, a CF profit.
A CF profit, bam. So that ability to do that is big. And so so then you have something about formation of character as virtue that is like language in the way you're describing. And it does make something in common to everyone who is so formed, because there's also well, you have in common because, like, you're capable of wit. I always think it's funny that Aristotle's like, wit is virtue. Yeah, it's, wit, actually, I think so. CFP. So, it goes there, right? But there's also something about, if you knew that the places you went into, the people there are, going to be trying to respond. Like, you talk about in your paper about the host, when there's an awkward moment, they reduce awkwardness. They're able to, there's absolutely something about virtue ethics that is about reducing awkwardness. And if you are able to know that whatever space you go into, people are good at reducing awkwardness, you're going to be more likely to go in, because it's more likely not to, like, suck or have high transaction cost, whatever, right? And so then that increases the flow and the movement, and yet there's no top down. There's simply the kind of awareness that there's sufficient virtue in the system. And then the argument would be, there was a lot more things, but I'll stop. Virtue, an argument could be that a sufficient amount of virtue also is part of creating the environment that incubates in a sufficient number of people the philosophy, the entrepreneurship ergo that you're describing, to make sure that there's not an overfitting of a single value form. And also the ability to respond to surprise. I really think it is extremely important to associate virtue with handling surprise. Like, there's too much of virtue, like it's virtue that is able to respond to the unexpected in a manner that maintains the mean, the CFP. That ability creates environments that actually make people able to do the philosophical. Because the other thing, one more thing. Like, basically, a lot of people are like, man, being compressed into a single value form of commoditization, how terrible. I can't believe it. No, people want it. People absolutely want it, because then I can go into situations and know we have something in common. I can ask you about your work. Like, you start telling me about your beliefs, or we try to talk about first principles and ideas. I don't know what to think about that. And now my entire worldview is in question and stuff like that. So there's a way in which, like, people want alienation, actually. Like, that's also like a libidinal kind of psychoanalytical thing. Like, people say they don't want alienation, and then they encounter the neighbor who annoys them. And then they want that commoditization, right? Or they encounter they're a Christian and they encounter the Hindu. Then they want the compression, the shrinking of people to a single value form, right? So that means there's a lot more to be said about that. But there's also a dimension of the single value form, autonomous rationality, all the ways I'll put it, that there's a libidinal reason that people wanted to actually avoid the challenge of otherness, the anxiety of the other, right? And also what this would mean is, let's say you were to help the world move beyond autonomous value form exchange, right? Commodity. Let's say you were to do it. Well, if people aren't ready for that, to encounter the other in their fullness, well, then everyone just kills one another, right? And they just kind of fall apart, right? And actually, I would argue, and this is what I have to expand on, but I'll pass it before I do, on this question of what is the kind of normative, so, like, what is it selecting for, right? Like, what is the class selecting for? Which I think is that there is something about the environment of global interconnectivity that is actually creating an environment of people having to encounter otherness. And there is going to be an increasing selection of the worldviews or the maps or the norms that actually is able to handle that amount of complexity encountering with otherness. Now, I have to say a lot more about that, but I'll stop for now.
I pulled a book off the shelf because I was reminded of one of my favorite passages from, this is the first paragraph of the William James Pragmatism lectures, right? And now I remember it, it's just the whole paragraph is an entire quote from Chesterton. So this is actually just Chesterton. And he says, in the preface to that admirable collection of essays of his called Heretics, Mr. Chesterton writes these words: "There are some people, and I am one of them, who think that the most practical and important thing about a man is still his view of the universe. We think that for a landlady considering a lodger it is important to know his income, but still more important to know his philosophy. We think that for a general about to fight an enemy, it is important to know the enemy's numbers, but still more important to know the enemy's philosophy. We think the question is not whether the theory of the cosmos affects matters, but whether in the long run anything else affects them." So In a sense that, I mean, I was mostly thinking of that first example of the landlady, right? Is thinking, of course, I want to know his income to know the basic. Does he have credit? Is he going to be able to pay for, his rent? Am I going to be able to pay my mortgage, et cetera, et cetera? But secondarily, this is going to be a person who lives here. I can't imagine all of the situations that I'm going to run into with this person who's going to live in my situation. There's going to be some kind of conflict at some point. What are going to be the ideas, virtues, spirit that resolves and addresses those situations, right? So that's why she cares about that, right? In a sense, you could try to subsume that income into that philosophy sense, right? Oh, is this a person who rallies their resources towards these things and they're thinking of money in the same terms that I do, right? That in a sense, them being in a world with some commodities that I share with them is also their part of their philosophies and overbeliefs, as he calls it, right? So I'm so fascinated in this issue, and I think this is maybe um, a place that I'd want to go more in my own research, and a little bit also what I talked to you about, Daniel, about this idea of Tocquevillian growth, right? Which is a way of steel manning Marx even more, which is to say something like, what are the kinds of goods which afford the philosophers or the people who still do not think only in terms of exchange value, right? Um, and it's possible that the more we think in terms of exchange value and the more that we produce in terms of exchange value, we make it harder to build those kinds of institutions that don't only think in terms of exchange value and therefore break down the ability to break out of exchange value if we need to, like we went down the slippery slope, right? Um, that's super fascinating, and I guess CFP relates to that somehow. And that's basically why I said though that in our initial conversation, um, that what people fear mostly you know, is not the effort. Like I'm sure that somebody would be more than happy to put in effort to have regular neighborhood block parties, right? The thing that they're actually worried about is who's going to run them, what kind of music are we going to have, what kind of food are we going to have, how are we going to make sure that they don't have them at random times that I can't predict, right? You want to remove all of that kind of uncertainty from your life, right? And that would actually make you more willing to lean into those things. What coordinates or reduces that sort of uncertainty, not just the uncertainty of, oh, I don't know which thing it's going to be, so I don't know which side of the road to drive on, or I don't know which thing to do to make sure it doesn't blow up, but also how do I know it's coordinated around these higher goals, right? Um, so that's just a fascinating issue to think of. What institutions facilitate that, and what do those institutions trade off with, right? And we like to think of academia as one of those places that is where we've cordoned off exchange value and have coordinated by other means, but there's so many other things that you need to worry about. The vagueness, the hidden hierarchies. That's what people worry about, and that's where people are invited to conspiracy theorize about everything, right? And so people think, oh, it's exchange value or conspiracy theories. Those are the two options, right? That's interesting to me. And conspiracy theories are becoming so much more popular in the political landscape from every
Let me say
angle.
something about your Tocquevillian growth.
Yeah.
So the idea here is, and go ahead and correct me, but you have groups of people who join, let's say, a club, um, and they're participating in building something else besides, or building some kind of other value form besides exchange value. And that then leads them to anticipate and make judgments under other uncertainties besides uncertainties in the market. And so if that's the case, then there's something really interesting about the organization of a club, where we let people in up to a certain number of people. It might even be a certain kind of people. We might have to vet them. But once they're in, there's no like bounds. I guess like there's no rivalry uh, um, in the economic sense. That is, if I'm participating in this club, it doesn't keep you out. Like we both can do it at the same time. In fact, it's better when we both do it at the same time. That's part of the value of it. And so there's this non-rivalry, but there's some excludability happening here. And so I wonder if is there something else about those features that matter for Tocquevillian growth. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, well, my initial thought was with Tocquevillian growth was more related to the Yanniconi kind of theory of clubs, where so the idea is, hey, if we make it more, if we say in order to join this club, you need to close off other opportunities, right? And when everyone who has joined the club has closed off other opportunities, then when they're thinking, where am I going to distribute my effort and resources, it's towards that club to make that club greater. Right? So if people worry that people are going to join the club and then not dedicate to increasing its value, right? Then if I join a club that is screening only people in who don't have other options, then I know that they're going to put everything into this club, right? Now the trade-off there is well, then when I'm making the decision, do I join this club or not? It matters what kind of other opportunities I have, right? So one of the other things that Yanniconi's theory predicts is that people who have less other opportunities, people who like if in order to join this monastery, I need to become an ascetic and give up sex, money, and power and food, right? If I don't really like those things anyway, I'm more likely to join the club, right? And it has the same exact effect. It still ensures that all of my effort and resources go towards this club. It has the same effect, but it selects for a certain type of person that either has a preference for this thing over everything else anyway, or didn't really have much access to those things otherwise. So where you can potentially get a self-undermining club is where you have a club that what the club is doing is producing those other opportunities. That's kind of what education is, right? So if people who have low education would be willing to give up everything in their life to be in a club where everyone is 100% committed to education, but the purpose of that education was not just to create more education, but to go out and do something outside of that club, right? So I guess you might think of the school model in general as a place where people who have no virtue, so they have no opportunities in life. They suck at everything, right? And then they go into the club, right? They're willing to give up everything to commit to everything. The teachers and all the students have committed to it. Then they all raise in virtue, and once they've reached a certain level of virtue, you go, I'm out of this market, right? The only people that stick in are the people who the you might think of it as the permanent academics, the people who only want to use their virtue towards the ends of creating more knowledge of a certain kind, right? And so there's a sense in which um, certain kinds of communities produce ideas, but if those ideas are what make the things that you gave up to be in that club more attractive, then those are self-undermining clubs. And I wonder what kinds of clubs are in that set and what kinds of clubs are not in that set.
That's almost exactly what you want for growth. You want to be able to cultivate um, that virtue, like you said, and then be able to transfer it to more domains. And so this is the point of Paul Romer. He says that there's other things that are both non-rival and partially excludable. And these are like recipes. Like you come up with a good recipe, like you can share it wherever, and it's great for everybody. And there's no harm. It's just pure value. And so maybe there's something there where like you do want some selection for your leaders in the club where they're giving up a lot to stay and cultivate their virtue. But for some set of participants, you want them to be able to join the club and join a bunch of other clubs too. And that's kind of where the growth. I don't know. I'm just kind of I'm workshopping out loud as we're thinking about Tocquevillian growth.
You go ahead,
I
Daniel.
think
Yeah.
that I think is magnificent. So a bunch of things. So there's a few things. So if I were to say like what I think, like on this idea of what is the norm, what is the character, what is the virtue that actually you can say, because on this idea of like what is fitting, like because I also agree with what you're saying that in every norm there's a practice, right? There's like a practice and norm, they go together, absolutely 100%, right? And so there's some sort of idea that if there's a norm, or worldview or an idea of what is the good, et cetera, that there's a kind of question of what would be the grounding principle or the test, or that would give us reason to think that it is that which people should organize according to versus something else, right? So to say something very, very large, I think basically global interconnectivity with the internet, global pluralism, encountering with difference. Basically, we're all on the verge of being crazy. like overwhelmed with information, like everyone is. Like, Peter Berger talks about everyone is an existentialist now, like even if you don't know what existentialism is, because you are constantly reflecting on yourself because you have all these choices. You're free as of the 20th century, right? And so you could be an engineer or you could go to college. And so you have to reflect on who am I to ask what choices are you going to make, or at least that's the mover to the inner, and that makes you an existentialist. And the problem is being an existentialist could make you, well, crazy, unless you have an idea of how to deal with that, right? And so there is something unique about our age that is increasingly making the average person, quote unquote, anxious, existential, philosophical. The loss of Givens is the unleashing of release, Philip Reef, all of this different stuff. So we're all kind of on the verge of being crazy, okay? And some of the ways people respond to that is by finding a conspiracy that is a constraint that makes everything kind of make sense. They find a strong man or they become a hikikomori. Like we're seeing growing hikikomorism, incels, all different forms of it, right? And so basically, to say something quite large, I think we are trying to determine the norm of which makes you actually able to handle that environment and not go crazy, and in fact continue to reproduce and have community, because that is going to be very difficult. And there is an argument to be made that we in a sense we don't know what it is. Maybe it's Christianity plus an emphasis on beauty plus an awareness of hike plus going to the YMCA. Maybe it's living on a farm plus relationships with being part of a universe. Like there's a combination of all these qualities, right? That actually I think the TLC is a great example of people exchanging ideas, trying to figure out what to absorb, what not to absorb, that gives me some sort of way to actually navigate the madness of the world, that I actually am not only able to survive it, but thrive in it, right? And I would argue that maybe also dropping birth rates and all of these things are kind of like indications of what worldviews can actually handle that or not, because there's a way in which we've asked like what maps or worldviews are true that correspond with reality. We all know these questions are different things. Well, those questions are also kind of, for Aristotle, going to be tied to fittedness, right? And so what is fitting for this global interconnected world that wants to make us all crazy, that actually we don't become crazy? We're actually able to find something. The word we like to emphasize with Jochen and others is beautiful. What if this global interconnectivity tied with pluralism affords experiences of beauty that otherwise could not occur? And that I think actually the competition, the meeting of normative claims, which then means you have to have people that are able to handle talking about them, right? And also every worldview generates its own language to talk about its worldview. So you got to develop the skill of, I call it the meta language skill, which is the ability to hear other people's languages, like the economist, the sociologist, the literary person, the Christian, the atheist, and able to actually work them together, like able to figure out the overlap. Like you learn the meta language skill to move between languages, but also not lose information, which is insanely difficult and no one does it perfectly. That's why you need to do it a lot. Like there are some skills there that actually are necessary in order to not be selected out by the collective subconscious, the collective, like the environment of interconnectivity that is existentially, libidinally demanding on people. And I think that's going to be big and basically need virtue. A few more things. You could argue that those spaces that were being described, churches, religions, were like they could have people talk about not just practices, but the metaphysics, like the ideas. And it turns out that it's really important to have those spaces that go together, where you actually, as the landlady, you kind of have a sense of the values of the person there. Well, churches could help with that. But then, of course, if they are too constrained and not able to encounter otherness, the collision of the new age atheism, and not undergo deconstruction or whatever, then those things can fall apart. So you need to, but there's something there about the ability to actually think first principles, to think the norms, and to actually be able to converse about them and to discuss them. That becomes really, really, really important, because it forms the kind of subject, the kind of person in terms of character that can handle the interconnected world and not be overwhelmed by it and not be destroyed. And I guess there's a lot more to say, but I'll stop. I think also the frame I think about on what you were just describing about what is the nature of these spaces where you go in and they have this kind of self-undermining, I think exactly that gets tied to growth. There's also something to be said about membranic structures where they let things in and let things out. It's not walls. You can kind of pass through them, and there could be many of these forms, right? I think what Kurtis was saying, like about the ability to move between many, Well, that means you're the kind of person that can handle otherness, handle surprise, handle encounter, move between. That's virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is also tied to the ability to handle other normative claims and not be overwhelmed, or the ability not to be overly reliant on a single one, like the exchange value. So that ability to move is also something like movement and virtue go together. The ability to move between spaces goes together. There's a lot more to say. I'll stop.
Yeah, I think I'd say that the university is an example of one of those kind of clubs that does
Yeah.
work, right? It's designed to create the characteristics in people that would make them want to do something that is not being done at that club, right? So what you said, Curtis, about there being different selection mechanisms for the people who are going to stay there, the teachers, right, and the people who are in and the students, right, who are there to get enough to they're committed to the club while they're there, and then they get enough that they end up leaving, right? That's a good model. Though you might think of the teachers are being selected into the whole university system. They go to a low tier university, and then they get enough at that low tier university, enough publications to go to a higher tier one, and there's a potential undermining of lower tier universities not being able to be little places, right? Or little incubators of these things, right? So that could be a meta problem for that tier. But churches might be one of these institutions that does self undermine because there's nothing too critical keeping anybody at one particular church, right? Or the church might afford certain characteristics or certain qualities for the community that the community benefits from and depends on, right? But that might also make the community productive enough that the church then becomes an option, and then it becomes an option that somebody doesn't take. Right. So at low levels of income, everyone will stick with the church. But as income starts to increase, people start to defect. Right. Um, yeah, I guess that's what I have. Curtis has thought about this a lot before too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything specific there, just that you can think of a bunch of different club models where um, you're producing some kind of virtue that's useful in other domains. And so then your question then is, how do we make use of that without undermining our club? And I mean, that's like, it is a problem. I don't know if it's a novel problem, but it's like, how do we specifically do that? Like, how do we specifically use this new productive capacity we have while keeping our club structure the same? And I don't know, this is something that you and Tegan have thought about too with your creedal paper. I wonder if there's literally contracts that do this well, in the terms of like contracting, like, you can join our club, and this is how we manage that problem. Because I don't know, I guess I just haven't thought about that
I
problem in that
I
specific
guess
way.
what a small university is always a residual claimant of is your reputation in the future. So it's always, oh, they came from there. So there must be something about that. So no matter where you go after that, if it's recognized that you developed virtue at that place, then that will attract other people to you. So that's one thing, right? Um, but also from what Daniel said, talking about fertility, right? Families as clubs that need good governance is a huge issue. And so I mean, that's Jesus Fernandez Villaverde, who's down the road here at University of Pennsylvania, is making this. It seems like the way he's talking, it's like going to be the thing he talks about for the rest of his life, which is not a bad thing to think about. But he's also said it's probably going to be the issue of the 21st century in ways that we can't really fathom yet, right? Because the global population seems like we always think of it as a huge boulder that just keeps rolling, right? But you were one generation away from extinction at any moment, right? You could have a global whatever what do you call it, sterility atom bomb that just then the whole thing is done in like 25 years, right? Um, so governance of the family seems to be a big part of that to me, right? A lot of people talk about the go ahead, Curtis.
I was just gonna say that this is a perfect example of where your goal is to train your members in virtue and send them out to be productive, but yet still be tied to the club. I mean, this is like a similar idea to the university that
Yeah,
works. It's a club model that works. So how do we get
yeah,
more club models like that work? And maybe it's start again with the family, but I don't know.
yeah. One thing I was just thinking of though too is the different feminist movements through the last 150 years. You so on a more, I guess, reactionary right-wing take would be, well, these are women who really wanted to be free riders. They wanted to defect from family responsibilities and get the benefits that they saw had only gone to men. But I think that you might actually think of the various feminist movements as more like canaries to various other crises in the governance of households. The earlier late 19th century feminist movements were in many cases responses to like the temperance movements, which were associated with the feminist movements, were responses to men being abusive when they get drunk. In the United States, a large wave of that after people basically coming home from the Civil War, right? So you go, okay, why wasn't there a temperance movement after every single war in history, right? That where men came home and got really drunk and hit their wives, right? Well, one, maybe there were other local clubs that were solving those problems in ways that we didn't realize, right? And so what the feminist movement was just saying, oh, we actually lost something. We didn't realize that we lost it, so we need to respond to this problem. Or you can think of that as maybe that was such a huge problem for all of history, and the feminist movement is actually taking advantage of clubs that could be produced that couldn't have been produced before. This is kind of the age of Tocqueville, looking at America, right? But then it's possible that those kinds of movements that then want to reorganize gender relationships then make it harder to know, well, how do you govern a family in the first place, and then breaks apart that family. So um, if a huge part of clubs is being willing to sacrifice everything and basically you can't do a diversified portfolio of clubs. That's part of the nature of their production, right? Then the one that you commit to, the CEO better be a good guy, right? And it's very, very hard to figure out who's a good guy, who would be a good CEO. And so that's what all of these intermediate things are. I think it would be a fascinating place to keep looking and keep researching. We've been going for like hour 45. So think in terms of final thoughts. That's what I'll say.
Well, you guys are awesome. I don't know where the hour 45 went. The problem you're just highlighting there, okay, that is absolutely massive. Um, so again, and forgive me anytime in this conversation if I haven't used the language perfectly, forgive me. And I really do appreciate the work that you two are doing. I just think it's really important. Um, so if you are part of a club or an organization, and the organization is able to give you access to something that is ever deepening. And every time you visit, it's the same, but there's ever deepening characteristic to it, right? Then there's a sense in which you are always sent out from level one, but when you come back, it's level two, and it's the same, but it's actually different, right? And you could argue that the kind of like mysteries in the church could do this, right? And so, furthermore, there's this idea that I think really successful organizations or community or whatever the right term is, that they're able to do this thing that every time you come back to it, it's as if you're coming back to it for the first time, right? And that there's actually something ever deeper. So the commitment becomes one not just of a kind of legality like I ought to and should, but it actually becomes one of a commitment of attraction to what it enables you to. Right. A good example of this is when you experience the Bible, like when you really read the Bible and go, oh, wow, I can read it like every time and it's something different. Right. There's something about the best organizations that have this kind of structure. And what I want to say is that creating the conditions of which generate this kind of organization or gathering is really, really hard. Right. Like you have to find certain people of certain ways that are actually able to generate this experience. Maybe they're all bound by CFP, et cetera, so forth. Right. It has been incredibly difficult in history to find the people of whom there is good reason to believe might actually be able to create that effect. And one of the reasons that it was so difficult is because of what I've called the introduction problem. And the introduction problem is that you have to spend a whole lot of time, usually for most of history, in order to figure out where a person even is at. Right? Like you don't even know their interests. You don't even know what they like talking about. You don't know their personality. It takes like 3 years to overcome the introduction problem.
That's
Right?
that's the
And
classic example of awkwardness. Of
yes,
when it's
yes.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And so, Thomas Jockin talks about the on-ramping issue. Like so much of education could be just getting people on the on-ramp, right? Like getting them to where they kind of know level one lingo. You can't even start, right? What if you had a way to more effectively deal with the introduction problem? or to more effectively deal with the on-ramping problem, right? That would save a whole lot of time, a whole lot of transaction costs, right? Well, thanks to the Econ Playground YouTube channel, I'm able to overcome the introduction problem with Marcus and Hingl because of the papers. I'm able to actually overcome that. And then imagine before this technology, if we wanted to have this meeting, the logistic costs would be very high. It would be very difficult. It would be hard to do. So for most of history, you had to overcome the introduction problem and the logistic problems, and you didn't even know which introduction, like which efforts of overcoming introduction would be worth it, and therefore which efforts of logistics would be worth it, because you can have good, but it doesn't work in the logistics. So eventually you say, forget it. I'm not even going to try. And then we don't have the social anymore. We just have the institutions on offer that may not be able to create that ever deepening experience that I described, right? Unless you just get lucky and happen to be in a community that does that, but maybe it's just a generation, right? Well, then you can't have this kind of Tocquevillian growth that needs this comeback, deepening. You're able to actually change the kind of experience. And there's a lot to be said of that, because that gets into the whole metaphysics of beauty stuff. But so the introduction problem is really, really held back human development. It's really, really held back. And also it's also really held back our potential and willingness to travel, to go to different places, because like where would I even go? Why would I go to Texas? Why would I go to Philadelphia? Right? Why would I go to these? Why would I go to West Virginia? Oh, because Curtis is there. Oh, because Marcus is there. Right? And you've overcome the introduction problem. So you have very good reason to think that if you would actually go there, that it would actually be a good time. Like it could be CFP because you've overcome the introduction problem. That now there's a million more things to say about the social coordination mechanism, and how that also then makes it, the key also is experiencing all that also makes it plausible to you that there actually are other value forms. Like until you experience, you can talk all day about actually there's things beyond the market or whatever. Well, I don't experience it. Where's it at? You guys talk a big game. Where's it at, right? Well, because you have to experience it. And it's just really difficult to have effectively coordinated that experience for people to make it plausible to them that there are other value forms, and that it opens new social possibilities that can open emergent potentials of the human being. So I think basically what I want, so there's a lot to say to that, but organizations as well that are able to not undermine themselves as they are used, or they kind of generate the virtue in people, are also going to be organizations that I think are actually contributing to people in the movement of the social coordination mechanism. And that doesn't mean that colleges or hospitals or institutions are bad. I actually think that a more effective kind of Silk Roads, if you will, between all of those things can actually open a lot of doors. There's way too much more to say. I'll just stop. Thank you, gentlemen, for being awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, this was just been great. Thanks, Daniel. And yeah, I'm being enlightened. This is CFP. This is it.
Yeah, we could CFP all day. The the first thing I wrote down in my notes to talk about, because I read it this morning when you were talking about reading the scriptures, it reminded me. I read it this morning. Um, and I'll leave, it's such an interesting topic, and I'll leave it, and then we'll end the conversation. The sin only entered into the world. You might blame Eve for it, right? Because she's the one talking to the snake, right? But it's very important to note that it only entered into the world after Adam was divided into two people who were paying attention to different things, right?
Absolutely.
That's when that could enter in, right? That's when there was a possible miscoordination between the human who had been split into two, right? That's where the snake had an occasion to slip in and split people apart, right? And they turned from equals into the man over the woman, right? From you might call it misgovernance. Um, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Curtis. This is not the last time that we will see each other online nor in person, right?
Okay.
I hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll stop the recording here. Thank you, guys.